I was on my knees in the parking lot, watching 20 years of my life turn to ash. My name is Tom Harris, and that November night, I lost everything I'd ever built. The workshop wasn't just a business, it was my father's legacy, my identity, the only thing I knew how to be. One electrical fire, one phone call, and it was gone. The smell of burning wood mixed with motor oil still haunts me. I stood there in the cold, my hands black with soot, staring at what used to be Harris Auto Repair, and I felt something inside me die along with those flames. I had no insurance, no savings, no plan B. For the first time in my life, I didn't know how to fix something. But here's what I didn't know that night, as I watched the firefighters pack up and drive away. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really supposed to build. Sometimes the fire doesn't destroy you, it redirects you. And sometimes the workshop you rebuild isn't made of bricks and tools. It's made of broken people finding their way back to hope. This is the story of how I went from fixing cars to fixing lives. How I learned that rock bottom isn't the end, it's the foundation. And how the worst night of my life became the spark that lit up hundreds of others. Because I didn't just lose my workshop that night, I found my purpose. The sound of metal against metal had been the soundtrack of my life for 2 decades. Every morning, I'd unlock the garage door of Harris Auto Repair at 6:30 sharp, and that first breath of motor oil and old leather would fill my lungs like oxygen. The radio would crackle to life, playing the same blues station my father listened to when he ran this place. I'd tie my work apron, grab my coffee, black, always black, and wait for the first customer to roll in with a busted transmission or a check engine light that wouldn't quit. This wasn't just a job, it was who I was. Tom Harris, the guy who could fix anything, the mechanic people trusted, the man who kept his word and his tools organized. I knew every socket wrench by touch, every creak in the floorboards, every oil stain on the concrete that told a story. My dad started this shop in 1978, back when Main Street actually meant something in our small Ohio town. He taught me everything: how to listen to an engine, how to treat people right, how to take pride in work done well. When he passed, I inherited more than a business. I inherited a legacy, a responsibility, a reason to wake up. But on November 14th, at 11:47 at night, my phone rang. I was half asleep when I answered. The voice on the other end was my neighbor, Danny, and he was out of breath. "Tom, you need to get to the shop now. There's smoke everywhere, man. I already called 911. I remember my heart dropping into my stomach. I threw on jeans and a jacket, didn't even tie my boots, and drove the 6 blocks faster than I should have. The streets were empty, cold, dark, and then I turned the corner onto Maple Avenue, and I saw the orange glow against the night sky. My workshop was burning. Flames were pouring out of the windows. Black smoke twisted into the air like ghosts. The old wooden sign my father hand-painted, Harris Auto Repair, Esther in 1978, was already half consumed by fire. I could hear the glass shattering inside, the crackling, the hissing. Firefighters were spraying water, but I could tell it was too late. I parked crooked in the middle of the street and just stood there, frozen. One of the firefighters, a guy I'd fixed a starter for just last month, came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "Tom, I'm sorry. Looks like an electrical short in the back room. It spread fast." I nodded, but I wasn't really hearing him. I was watching my entire life collapse in real time. The toolbox my dad gave me on my 16th birthday, the framed photo of him standing in front of the shop on opening day, the workbench where I taught my nephew how to change a tire, the hydraulic lift I saved 2 years to buy, the customer log with 20 years of names and stories. All of it. Gone. I walked as close as the firefighters would let me, and the heat hit my face like a slap. My hands were trembling. My chest felt tight. I wanted to scream, to run inside, to save something, anything. But there was nothing left to save. At some point, I dropped to my knees, right there in the parking lot. The asphalt was cold and wet. My hands were covered in soot from touching the fence. I stared at the flames, and I felt this crushing weight settle over me. Not just loss, but erasure. Like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd been, was being deleted from existence. I thought about my father, about how proud he'd been of this place, about the promise I made at his funeral to keep it going, to honor him, to never let it fall apart. And now, it was ash. The fire chief came over eventually and told me what I already knew. Total loss. The structure was unsound. They'd have to tear down what was left. I asked if anything inside survived, and he just shook his head. By 3 in the morning, the flames were out. What remained looked like a skeleton. Charred beams, twisted metal, piles of wet, smoking debris. The smell was unbearable, burning rubber and wood and dreams. I sat on the curb until sunrise, just staring. A few neighbors came by, brought me coffee I didn't drink, said things like, "Insurance will cover it," and "You'll rebuild." But I didn't have insurance, not the kind that mattered. I'd let the policy lapse 6 months earlier to save money during a slow season. Stupid. Reckless. And now, unforgivable. When the sun finally came up, I drove home in silence. I walked into my empty house, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at my hands. They were black with soot, shaking, useless. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to fix what was broken. Because what was broken was me. The days after the fire blurred together like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I'd open my eyes in the morning, and for a split second, everything would feel normal. Then reality would crash down like a wave, and I'd remember there was no shop to go to, no work waiting, no reason to get out of bed. I tried to keep a routine. I really did. I'd make coffee, sit at the kitchen table, stare at the newspaper without reading a single word. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before. Every second felt like an accusation. "What now, Tom? What now?" I didn't have an answer. My phone rang constantly those first few days. Friends, customers, people from church. Everyone wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was something they could do. I stopped answering. What was I supposed to say? That I was fine? That I'd figure it out? I didn't believe that myself. The truth was, I felt hollow. Like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me who I was. Without the shop, without the work, I didn't know what I was supposed to be. I wasn't a mechanic anymore. I wasn't a business owner. I wasn't carrying on my father's legacy. I was just a 52-year-old man with dirty hands and nothing to show for half a lifetime of work. I'd drive past the site sometimes, even though I knew I shouldn't. The building had been torn down within a week. Safety hazard, they said. Now it was just an empty lot with tire tracks in the mud and a chain-link fence around the perimeter. Someone had left flowers by the fence. I never found out who. I'd park across the street and just sit there, staring at nothing, trying to remember what it used to look like, trying to feel something other than this crushing emptiness. But all I felt was shame. Shame that I'd let the insurance lapse. Shame that I hadn't caught the electrical problem before it was too late. Shame that I couldn't protect the one thing my father trusted me to keep alive. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision I'd ever made, every shortcut I'd taken, every time I'd said, "I'll deal with it later," and never did. The fire wasn't just bad luck. It was my fault. And that knowledge sat on my chest like a boulder. I started avoiding people. I'd see neighbors outside and duck back into my house before they could wave. I'd go to the grocery store at midnight when I knew it'd be empty. I stopped going to church, stopped answering the door, stopped pretending I was okay. My nephew Jake came by one afternoon. He was 23, worked at the hardware store, always looked up to me. He knocked for 10 minutes before I finally opened the door. "Uncle Tom, man, you look terrible." I shrugged. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. When's the last time you ate or showered?" I didn't answer because I honestly didn't remember. He came inside without asking, started making me a sandwich, talking about how people in town were asking about me, how everyone wanted to help. I sat at the table staring at my hands, those same hands that used to fix everything, now useless and still. "What do you need?" Jake asked. "Money? A place to stay? Just tell me." I looked up at him, and I felt this wave of exhaustion so deep I could barely speak. I need my dad back. I need my shop back. I need to not have failed at the one thing I was supposed to do. Jake didn't say anything. What could he say? Some things can't be fixed with good intentions and a sandwich. After he left, I sat in the silence again. The house felt bigger than it ever had. Every room echoed. The TV stayed off, the radio stayed silent. I'd walk from the kitchen to the living room, to the bedroom, and back again, like I was searching for something I'd lost but couldn't name. I tried to think about the future, but every time I did, I hit a wall. Rebuild? With what money? Start over? Doing what? At my age? With my reputation tied to a pile of ash? People kept telling me I was strong, that I'd bounce back, that this was just a setback. But they didn't understand. This wasn't a setback. This was an ending. The story of Tom Harris, small-town mechanic, devoted son, keeper of promises, it was over. The fire had written the final chapter, and I was just too stubborn to close the book. I spent whole afternoons sitting on my back porch, watching the clouds move across the sky. I'd think about my father, about the day he handed me the keys to the shop, about the pride in his eyes. I'd think about all the customers I'd helped over the years, all the cars I'd brought back to life, all the conversations over a hood that needed adjusting or an oil pan that needed draining. And I'd wonder if any of it had mattered at all, because if it could all disappear in one night, if 2 decades could turn to smoke and ash in a matter of hours, then what was the point? What was I holding on to? The worst part wasn't the loss itself, it was the silence that came after. The void where purpose used to live, the empty space where my identity used to be. I was a mechanic who couldn't fix anything anymore, not even himself. Rock bottom has a sound, and for me, it was the rattle of loose change in my pocket. 3 weeks after the fire, I was standing in line at the grocery store, counting quarters and dimes to pay for bread and eggs. The cashier, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, looked at me with that mixture of pity and discomfort that I'd started to recognize everywhere. "Take your time, sir," he said softly. Sir, like I was some old man who needed patience and gentle handling. I handed him the exact change, grabbed my bag, and walked out with my head down. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, just breathing, trying to swallow the lump in my throat, trying to remember when I became the guy people felt sorry for. But something happened that afternoon, something small, maybe even stupid. I was driving home when I saw old Mrs. Patterson's car on the side of the road, hood up, steam pouring out. She was standing there in her church dress, looking lost and worried. Without thinking, I pulled over. "Mrs. Patterson, you okay?" She turned, relief flooding her face. "Oh, Tom, thank God! I don't know what happened." "It just started making this terrible noise and—" "Pop the hood. Let me look." My hands moved before my brain could catch up. Radiator hose, blown clean through. Simple fix, really. I kept a spare in my truck. Old habit from my shop days. 20 minutes later, I had her back on the road. She tried to pay me. I refused. "Tom Harris, you take this money. I know you need it." Those words stung more than she knew, but what stung more was that she was right. "Keep it, Mrs. Patterson, just drive safe." As I watched her drive away, something shifted inside me. My hands were dirty again. My mind had been focused. For 20 minutes, I hadn't thought about the fire or the failure or the emptiness. I'd just been a mechanic again, and it felt like breathing after being underwater. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how good it felt to fix something, to be useful, to remember who I was before everything fell apart. So I made a decision. A small one. Maybe even a desperate one. I cleared out half my garage at home, swept the floor, hung up the few tools I'd managed to salvage from the fire, mostly things I'd had at home for personal projects. It wasn't a shop. It was barely a workspace, but it was something. I put a sign on the community board at the library, "Basic car repairs, pay what you can." The first call came 2 days later. Guy named Marcus needed his brakes checked. He showed up with his 2 kids in the back seat, apologizing for not being able to pay much. "I can give you $20 and a casserole my wife made. That work?" I looked at those kids, remembered being their age in my dad's shop, and nodded. "That works." Word spread slowly. People started coming by, mostly folks who couldn't afford the big chain shops in the next town over. Single mothers, retirees on fixed incomes. Young guys working 2 jobs just to keep their car running so they could get to those jobs. I charged whatever they could pay. Sometimes that was $30. Sometimes it was a dozen eggs. Once, it was a hand-knitted scarf because the woman said she noticed mine was worn through. I won't lie, it wasn't enough, not even close. My savings were draining. My mortgage was 2 months behind. The electric company had sent a final notice. I was barely surviving, working twice as hard for a fraction of what I used to make. But something was different now. I had a reason to wake up. Every morning, I'd open that garage door and feel a spark of something I thought I'd lost. Purpose, maybe, or just proof that I still knew how to do the thing I'd spent my whole life learning. The work was hard in a different way now. I didn't have a lift, so everything was done on jack stands and my back screaming. I didn't have diagnostic equipment, so I relied on instinct and experience. I didn't have a waiting room, so people sat on folding chairs in my driveway, drinking coffee I made in my kitchen. It was humbling, humiliating even. But it was honest. One Saturday afternoon, I was under a rusted-out Civic, replacing a fuel filter, when I heard footsteps. I slid out to see Jake standing there with a bag from the hardware store. Brought you some supplies, he said. Boss gave me his employee discount. I wiped my hands on my jeans, throat tight. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did. Uncle Tom, what you're doing here, people are talking about it. In a good way. I'm barely making ends meet, Jake. This isn't exactly a success story. He crouched down next to me. You lost everything, and you're still showing up. You're still helping people. That's not failure, that's the opposite. I wanted to believe him. But when I looked around at my makeshift garage, at the pile of bills on my kitchen counter, at the life I used to have versus the life I was living now, it was hard to see anything but loss. Still, I kept going. Because what else was I supposed to do? Give up completely. Let the fire win. Every car I fixed felt like a small victory against the void. Every customer who drove away with a working vehicle felt like proof I still mattered, even if just a little. I started walking to the salvage yard on the edge of town, digging through piles of scrapped cars for parts I could clean up and reuse. The owner, Ray, started saving stuff for me. Alternators, starters, catalytic converters that still had life in them. You're like a ghost haunting my junkyard, he joked once. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a ghost of who I used to be, wandering through wreckage looking for pieces of myself. But ghosts don't bleed. Ghosts don't feel their knees ache from concrete floors. Ghosts don't lie awake at night wondering if they're fooling themselves into thinking any of this matters. I was still here, still fighting, still trying to build something from nothing, even if I didn't know what that something was yet. It was a Saturday morning in late January when everything started to change. Though I didn't know it at the time, the temperature had dropped overnight and my garage was freezing. I was working on a minivan for a woman named Sarah Chen, single mom, worked double shifts at the diner on Route 9. Her transmission was slipping, and I knew it was going to be expensive, the kind of expensive she didn't have. I was under the van, hands numb even with gloves on, when I heard her voice. How bad is it? I slid out and saw her standing there with her daughter, maybe 7 years old, holding her hand. The little girl was wearing a coat that was too thin for this weather, and I could see Sarah's eyes, tired, worried, bracing for bad news. I stood up, wiped my hands. The transmission's going. I can patch it for now, get you another few months maybe, but eventually you'll need a rebuild or a replacement. Her face fell. How much for the patch? $200 for parts and labor. I watched her do the math in her head, watched her shoulders sag. She pulled out her wallet, started counting bills with shaking hands. I have $163. I get paid on Tuesday. Can I bring you the rest then? Something in my chest twisted. I looked at that little girl, then at Sarah, and I thought about all the times my dad had done work for people who couldn't pay, how he'd say, "The money comes back around. Kindness always does." "Keep your money," I heard myself say. Sarah looked up, confused. "What?" "Keep it. You need it more than I do." "Tom, I can't." "Yes, you can. Consider it paid in full." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to argue, tried to insist, but I just shook my head and went back under the van. When I finished the repair an hour later, she was still standing there, daughter tucked against her side. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do this?" I didn't have a good answer. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't know how to say it. So I shrugged. "Because somebody's gotta." She wiped her eyes, then looked at me with an intensity that caught me off guard. "You know what you should do? You should teach this. There are people out there, people like me, people who've lost everything or never had anything to begin with, who need someone to show them how to survive, how to fix things, how to stand back up." I stared at her. "Teach? Yeah. Share what you know. There are people drowning out there, Tom. You could throw them a rope." She thanked me again, hugged her daughter, and drove away. But her words stayed behind, echoing in the empty garage. Teach. Share what you know. Throw them a rope. I went inside, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and thought about what she'd said. About all the people I'd been helping these past months. Marcus with his 2 kids. Mrs. Patterson. The young guy who worked at the gas station. The veteran who lived in the apartment complex downtown. All of them struggling. All of them trying. All of them one car repair away from missing work, losing a job, falling further behind. And I thought about myself. About how lost I'd been after the fire. How the void had almost swallowed me whole. How it was the work, the simple act of fixing things, that had pulled me back from the edge. What if Sarah was right? What if I could do more than just fix cars? What if I could help people fix their lives? The idea felt too big, too ambitious for a broke mechanic working out of his garage, but it also felt right in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. I kept thinking about my dad's shop, about how it was more than just a business. It was a community hub, a place where people came not just for repairs but for conversation, for advice, for connection. What if I could recreate that? Not the building. I didn't have the money for that, but the spirit of it, the purpose. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and started writing on the back of an old envelope, ideas, possibilities, a vision that was forming faster than I could capture it. What if I started a program? Something free, something for people who were struggling, who needed skills, who needed hope. I could teach basic auto repair, how to change oil, replace brake pads, diagnose problems, skills that could save people thousands of dollars, skills that could lead to jobs. But more than that, I could teach resilience. I could show people that you can lose everything and still find a way forward. That rock bottom isn't the end. That broken things can be fixed, including yourself. I called it the Rebuild Project, because that's what it was. A chance to rebuild. Not just cars, not just skills, but lives, confidence, purpose. The next morning, I was still buzzing with the idea. I called Jake, told him what I was thinking. He was silent for a long moment. Uncle Tom, that's actually incredible. When do we start? We? You think I'm letting you do this alone? I'm in. Whatever you need. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not just hope, not just purpose, but excitement. The kind of energy that makes you feel 20 years younger and ready to move mountains. I started reaching out. I called Ray at the salvage yard, asked if I could use part of his property. He said yes before I even finished explaining. I contacted the community center, the library, the local churches. I posted on community boards and social media. Free auto repair classes. Learn skills that can change your life. No experience necessary. All are welcome. The response was slow at first. A few emails, a couple phone calls, people skeptical that anything free could be worthwhile, people afraid it was too good to be true. But then Sarah Chen shared the post, and Marcus shared it, and Mrs. Patterson told everyone at church. And slowly, people started reaching out. A 40-year-old woman who'd just gone through a divorce and needed to learn how to maintain her own car. A 19-year-old kid who'd aged out of foster care and had nothing. A laid-off factory worker who needed a new skill to get back on his feet. Each message felt like validation, like proof that this crazy idea might actually matter. 2 weeks later, I had 15 people signed up for the first session. 15 broken people looking for a way to rebuild, just like me. The night before the first session, I sat alone in Ray's salvage yard, staring at the empty space we'd cleared out. It wasn't much. A covered area with a concrete slab, some work lights Jake had rigged up, and a few folding tables we'd borrowed from the church. The tools were a mix of donated equipment and my own salvaged pieces. Everything smelled like rust and motor oil and possibility. But sitting there in the dim light, doubt crept in like cold air under a door. What was I doing? Who was I to think I could help these people? I was a failure, a mechanic who couldn't even keep his own shop from burning down, a man who'd spent the last 3 months barely keeping his head above water. What did I have to teach anyone about rebuilding? I picked up a wrench, one of the few tools that had survived the fire. The handle was scorched black on one side, the metal warped from heat. I'd kept it anyway. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. My dad had given me this wrench when I was 16. Take care of your tools, he'd said, and they'll take care of you. I ran my thumb over the burned handle and felt something crack open inside my chest. Maybe that was the point. Maybe I wasn't supposed to stand in front of these people as some success story. Maybe I was supposed to stand there as someone who understood what it felt like to have everything taken away. Someone who knew the weight of failure. Someone who was still figuring it out, still fighting, still trying. I thought about Sarah Chen and her daughter, about Marcus and his kids, about all the messages I'd received from people who were scared and lost and looking for a lifeline. They didn't need someone perfect. They needed someone real. And if there was one thing I was, it was real. Real broken, real struggling, real determined to not let the fire have the last word. I stood up, looked around the space, and made a decision. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about rebuilding Tom Harris or salvaging my reputation or proving something to my dead father. This was about showing up for people who needed what I needed 3 months ago, a reason to keep going. I pulled out my phone and started typing notes. Not a lesson plan exactly, but a framework. What I'd say, how I'd approach it, the truth I'd tell. I'm not here because I have all the answers. I'm here because I lost everything and I'm still showing up. And if I can do that, so can you. That was it. That was the message. The next morning arrived too fast. I got to the salvage yard at 7, even though the session didn't start until 9. Jake was already there, setting up chairs, testing the lights. "You ready for this?" he asked. I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Not even a little bit." "Good. That means it matters." People started arriving around 8:45. I watched them pull into the lot, hesitant, uncertain. They stood by their cars for a moment before walking over, like they were deciding whether to commit or run. I recognized some faces. Sarah Chen, who brought coffee in a big thermos. Marcus, looking nervous but determined. A woman I didn't know with grease already under her fingernails, clearly had worked with her hands before. A young guy in an army jacket who wouldn't make eye contact. An older man who walked with a cane. By 9, there were 18 people standing in that space, looking at me like I had answers. My mouth went dry, my heart hammered. For a second, I thought about making an excuse, telling them this was a mistake, running back to my safe small garage where I only had to fix cars, not lives. But then I saw Sarah smile at me, encouraging, believing, and I remembered why I was doing this. I cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Tom Harris, and before we start, I need to tell you something." Everyone went quiet. 4 months ago, I lost my auto repair shop to a fire. I lost my tools, my income, my father's legacy. I lost everything I'd spent 20 years building, and I thought that was the end of my story. I could see people leaning in, connecting. But I was wrong, because here's what I learned. When you lose everything, you find out what you're made of. You find out if you're going to let the ashes bury you, or if you're going to use them as fertilizer to grow something new. The words were coming easier now, from somewhere deep and honest. I don't know most of your stories yet, but I know you're here, which means something in your life brought you to this parking lot on a Saturday morning. Maybe you lost a job, maybe you're trying to save money, maybe you just need to know you can fix something when everything feels broken. Heads nodded. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. "I'm not here to pretend I'm some expert who has it all figured out. I'm here because fixing things, engines, transmissions, brake lines, it saved my life. It gave me purpose when I had none, and I believe it can do the same for you." I held up the burned wrench. This tool survived a fire that destroyed everything else. It's damaged, it's not perfect, but it still works, and that's what we're going to learn here, that being damaged doesn't mean being useless, that you can be broken and still have value, that you can take what's left and build something that matters. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then Marcus started clapping, then Sarah, then everyone. I felt tears on my face and didn't bother wiping them away. "All right," I said, voice rough. "Let's get to work. Who wants to learn how to change their oil?" Every hand went up. We spent the next 3 hours in that salvage yard, and something magical happened. People who'd arrived as strangers started talking to each other, sharing stories, helping each other learn. The Army vet knew about engines from his time in the motor pool. The woman with grease under her nails had worked in a factory. The older man with the cane had been a shop teacher before he retired. Everyone had something to offer. Everyone belonged. By noon, when we wrapped up, people weren't in a hurry to leave. They stood around talking, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to come back next week. Sarah came up to me as people were packing up. "You did it, Tom. You really did it." I looked around at the faces, tired but smiling, uncertain but hopeful, and I realized something profound. The fire hadn't destroyed me. It had refined me, stripped away everything except what mattered most. And what mattered most was this: using what I knew to help others rise. I'd spent 20 years fixing cars. But now? Now I was learning to fix something more important. I was learning to help people fix themselves. The weeks that followed the first session turned into months, and those months started to look like something I never expected: a movement. Word spread fast in our small town. People told their friends, their neighbors, their co-workers. The 18 who showed up that first Saturday became 30 the next week, then 45. By the end of the first month, we had over 60 people rotating through sessions, and Ray had to help me expand the workspace. But it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about what was happening in that salvage yard every Saturday morning. People were changing. Marcus, the guy with 2 kids who could barely afford break work, started showing up an hour early to help me set up. He learned fast, absorbed everything like a sponge. Within 6 weeks, he was assisting me with the more complicated repairs, teaching newer members what I'd taught him. "I feel useful again," he told me one morning, his hands black with grease and his smile wider than I'd ever seen. For the first time since I got laid off, I feel like I have something to offer. The Army vet, his name was Daniel, had barely spoken during those first few sessions. He'd watch, listen, work quietly in the corner. But gradually, he started opening up. Turned out he'd been struggling with PTSD since coming home. Couldn't hold down a job, felt like he didn't fit anywhere anymore. "This is the first place I felt like I belong," he said one day while we were changing a timing belt. "Nobody looks at me like I'm broken here. They just see someone who knows how to fix things." I had to turn away for a moment, pretend I was looking for a tool, because his words hit too close to home. We started adding more than just basic repairs. A retired electrician named Frank volunteered to teach basic electrical systems. A woman named Patricia, who'd worked in part supply for 30 years, taught everyone how to source affordable parts and spot quality versus junk. The Rebuild project was becoming a real community, a family built from spare parts and second chances. Jake had been right there with me through all of it, and one Saturday he pulled me aside with an idea. "Uncle Tom, what if we took this further? What if we helped people not just learn skills, but actually get jobs?" I wiped my hands on a rag. "What do you mean?" "I've been talking to some of the guys at work. The dealership in Columbus is hiring. So is the fleet maintenance company in Canton. If we could certify people, give them real credentials, they could actually use this to change their lives. Not just save money on car repairs, actually build careers." The idea was bigger than anything I'd imagined. Certifications meant paperwork, official partnerships, legitimacy. It meant taking this informal gathering and turning it into something real. It scared me, but it also felt right. "Let's do it," I said. Over the next 2 months, we worked to make it happen. I contacted vocational schools, explained what we were doing. Most ignored me, but one, a community college about 40 minutes away, sent someone out to observe a session. Her name was Dr. Martinez, and she was the director of their automotive technology program. She stood back and watched for 2 hours, taking notes, asking questions. When the session ended, she approached me. "Mr. Harris, what you're doing here is remarkable. These people trust you. They're learning. But more than that, they're healing." I nodded, not sure where she was going with this. "I want to partner with you. My college can provide certification testing. We can validate the skills your students learn here. That way, when they go looking for work, they have something legitimate to show employers." I couldn't speak for a moment. This was exactly what Jake had envisioned, but hearing it from an actual institution felt surreal. "Why?" I finally asked. "Why would you do that?" She smiled. "Because this is what education is supposed to be. Not just about teaching skills, but about restoring dignity. You're doing both." The partnership changed everything. Suddenly, people weren't just learning to change oil. They were earning certificates in basic automotive maintenance. They weren't just fixing brakes. They were building resumes. The Rebuild project went from a weekend hobby to a legitimate pathway out of poverty, unemployment, and despair. Marcus was one of the first to complete the certification. 2 weeks later, he got hired at a repair shop in the next county. He came to tell me in person, brought his kids with him. "I start Monday," he said, tears in his eyes. "Full time. Benefits. Tom, I can actually take care of my family again." His oldest daughter hugged my leg. "Thank you for helping my daddy." I crouched down to her level. "Your daddy helped himself. He just needed someone to believe he could." But she was already running back to Marcus, and he was sweeping both kids up in his arms, laughing in a way that sounded like freedom. Stories like that kept coming. Daniel got hired by a logistics company maintaining their delivery fleet. Sarah Chen learned enough to get a job at a quick lube shop, which paid better than the diner and had better hours for her daughter. Patricia, the parts expert, started her own small online business reselling automotive parts. People were rebuilding their lives right in front of me, and somewhere along the way, I realized I was rebuilding mine too. My mortgage was current again. The electric company stopped sending threats. I wasn't rich, not even close, but I wasn't drowning anymore either. Some of the people who'd gone through the program insisted on donating back once they got on their feet. Not much, but enough to keep things running. Ray donated more space. The church donated more tables. A local tool company heard about what we were doing and sent over a pallet of basic tools. The Rebuild project wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in that salvage yard, now transformed with proper lighting, organized tool stations, and a wall covered with photos of graduates and their success stories. Jake came up beside me. "Dad would be proud, you know, of what you built here." I thought about that. about my father's shop, about the legacy I thought I'd lost in the fire. "This isn't what I built," I said quietly. "This is what we all built together. Every person who showed up broken and left a little more whole. That's the real legacy." Jake put his hand on my shoulder. "That's exactly what Dad would have said." And for the first time since the fire, I believed it might be true. 6 months after that first session, I got a call that changed everything. I was under a Ford Ranger, explaining to a newcomer how to identify a failing U-joint when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer, greasy hands, middle of teaching, but something made me slide out and pick up. "Is this Tom Harris, the Rebuild Project?" "Yes, ma'am. Who's calling?" "My name is Jennifer Wallace. I'm a producer with Ohio Stories, a local news program. We've been hearing about what you're doing, and we'd like to feature you." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, completely frozen. "Mr. Harris, you still there?" "Yeah, sorry, I don't know that we're really newsworthy. We're just helping people learn some basic skills." She laughed. "From what I've heard, you're doing a lot more than that. We'd love to come out, film a session, interview some of your participants. Would that be okay?" I looked around at the faces in the salvage yard. People bent over engines, helping each other, laughing, learning, and I thought about how much it had meant to all of us to have this space. If sharing our story could inspire someone else, somewhere else, to start something similar, how could I say no? "Okay," I said. "When do you want to come?" They showed up the following Saturday with cameras and microphones and lights. I was nervous as hell, kept stumbling over my words, but Jennifer was patient. She interviewed me first, asked about the fire, about the decision to start teaching, about what the Rebuild Project meant to me, then she talked to the participants. Marcus told her about losing his job, about feeling worthless, about how learning these skills gave him his confidence back, and eventually a new career. Daniel spoke quietly about his PTSD, about how working with his hands in a supportive environment helped him find peace. Sarah talked about being a single mom, about how expensive car repairs used to terrify her, about how now she could handle basic maintenance herself and even help other women do the same. Story after story. Transformation after transformation. When Jennifer finished, she shook my hand with tears in her eyes. "This is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in 10 years of journalism. Thank you for letting us tell your story." The segment aired 2 weeks later. I watched it at home, alone, and I barely recognized myself on screen. The man talking about rebuilding and second chances and community, he looked like someone who had it together, someone with purpose, someone whose life mattered. Was that really me? The response was immediate and overwhelming. My email inbox flooded with messages. People from across Ohio, from Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, wanting to know how to start similar programs in their communities. Churches asking if I'd come speak. Civic organizations requesting presentations. A state representative reached out to talk about funding opportunities for vocational training programs. Within a month, the Rebuild Project had a waiting list 300 people deep. Ray and I had a serious conversation about space. We couldn't accommodate everyone in the salvage yard. We needed something bigger. But bigger meant money, permits, insurance, all the things I'd been avoiding thinking about. That's when the donations started coming in. Anonymous gifts, $50 here, $100 there, local businesses offering supplies. A retired shop owner donated his entire tool collection when he saw the news segment. A construction company offered to build us a proper facility, at cost. People wanted to help. They wanted to be part of something that mattered. By fall, we'd broken ground on a real building. Nothing fancy. A metal structure with proper bays, heat, electricity, and space for 60 people at a time. Volunteers showed up every weekend to help with construction. It felt like an old-fashioned barn raising, everyone pitching in because they believed in what we were building. The day we opened the new facility, over 200 people showed up for the ribbon cutting. The mayor came. The news crews came back. But more importantly, all the people whose lives had changed came. Graduates in their work uniforms, current participants bringing their families, volunteers who'd given their time and skills. I stood at the front with a pair of oversized scissors, looking at the faces in the crowd, and I had to stop for a moment to collect myself. A year ago, I started, voice shaking, I was on my knees watching my life burn to the ground. I thought that fire took everything from me. My business, my father's legacy, my identity, my purpose. People were silent, listening. But I was wrong. That fire didn't take everything. It took what I thought mattered. The building, the tools, the business, and left behind what actually mattered. The knowledge, the skills, the heart to serve. And most importantly, It left me alive and able to start over. I looked at Marcus, at Daniel, at Sarah, at all the faces I'd come to know and love. The rebuild project isn't about me. It's about all of us. Every person who showed up scared and left stronger. Every person who took what they learned here and used it to build a better life. Every person who proves that rock bottom isn't the end. It's the foundation. I cut the ribbon, and people cheered. We flooded into the new building, and it was beautiful. Clean bays, organized tools, proper lighting, workbenches with names carved into them by the people who'd built them, a wall dedicated to success stories, a bulletin board covered in job postings and thank you notes. This was real. This was lasting. This was bigger than anything I could have built alone. News outlets from neighboring states picked up the story. I got invited to speak at conferences, at universities, at business forums. People wanted to know the secret. How did a failed small-town mechanic create something that was changing lives across the region? The secret was simple. I showed up broken and refused to pretend I wasn't. I told the truth about failure, about loss, about the struggle to keep going when everything says quit. And in that honesty, people saw themselves. They saw permission to be broken and still be worthy. Permission to start over. Permission to rebuild. By the end of that first year, the Rebuild Project had trained over 400 people. 230 had earned certifications. 147 had found employment in automotive fields or started their own small repair businesses. But the numbers didn't capture what really mattered. What mattered was the single mom who could finally afford to keep her car running, the veteran who found community again, the laid-off worker who discovered a new career, the teenager who learned he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. What mattered was that people who'd lost hope found it again in a salvage yard, surrounded by broken things being made useful. Just like me. I never rebuilt my father's shop, but I built something better. I built a place where broken people learn they're not broken at all, just unfinished. 2 years after the fire, I found myself standing in front of the old lot where Harris Auto Repair used to be. The fence was gone now. The lot had been cleared and repaved. Someone had planted flowers along the edge. I never found out who. In the early morning light, with dew still on the grass, it looked peaceful. Like the fire had never happened. Like the pain had been absorbed into the earth and transformed into something gentler. I came here sometimes before sunrise, before the day got busy, to remember, to reflect, to talk to my dad even though I knew he wasn't really there. I think I finally understand, I said quietly to the empty lot. You didn't leave me the shop so I could run a business. You left me the skills so I could serve people. The building was never the legacy. The heart behind it was. A cool breeze moved through, and I could almost hear his voice. Now you're getting it, son. I smiled, wiped my eyes, and headed to the Rebuild Project facility. Even at 6 in the morning, I knew people would already be there. Sure enough, when I pulled into the parking lot, there were 3 cars waiting. I recognized them all. Daniel's truck, a sedan belonging to a woman named Kim who was working toward her ASE certification, and a beat-up Honda that belonged to Tyler, a 19-year-old who'd been homeless 6 months ago. They were inside already, coffee brewing, talking quietly while they prepped for the day's session. When I walked in, they looked up and smiled. Morning, Tom, Daniel said. We got here early to set up Bay 3. The lift was acting up yesterday. Already fixed it, Tyler added, wiping his hands on a rag. Just needed adjustment on the safety locks. I looked at these people, once broken, now thriving, and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with gratitude. You guys didn't have to do that, Kim laughed. Tom, you gave us everything. The least we can do is make sure the next group has working equipment. The next group. That's what this had become. A continuous cycle of people helping people. Those who'd been lifted up turning around to lift others. The Rebuild Project had taken on a life of its own, bigger than me, sustained by the very people it had helped. Throughout that day, I watched it happen over and over. Marcus, now working full-time as a mechanic, came back to teach a session on brake systems. Sarah brought her daughter, who was now volunteering in the office, scheduling appointments and managing the waiting list. Frank, the retired electrician, was training 3 new volunteers on electrical diagnostics. At lunch, a young man approached me nervously. His name was Chris, and this was his 2nd week. Mr. Harris, can I ask you something? Call me Tom, and sure. He shifted his weight, looked down at his shoes. How did you know? After you lost everything, how did you know it was worth trying again? I studied his face. 22, maybe 23, with the kind of tired eyes that come from carrying too much weight too young. I didn't know, I said honestly. Not at first. For a long time, I thought the fire had ended my story, but eventually I realized something. The fire didn't end my story. It just ended a chapter. And I got to choose what the next chapter would be about. But how do you choose when everything feels hopeless? I put my hand on his shoulder. You start with one small thing, one repair, one day, one moment where you prove to yourself that you still matter. And then you do it again the next day, and the next, until one day you look up and realize you've built something worth keeping. His eyes were wet. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 weeks, lost my apartment, lost my job. I don't know if I can do this. Chris, you're already doing it. You showed up. That's the hardest part. Everything else is just one step at a time. He nodded, wiped his face quickly. Thanks, Tom. I mean it. As he walked away, Jake came up beside me. You changed that kid's life just now. You know that, right? I shook my head. I just told him the truth. He'll change his own life. We're just here to show him it's possible. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked through the facility alone. I touched the workbenches, read the names carved into them. I looked at the wall of success stories, photos of graduates in their uniforms, holding their certification papers, standing beside cars they'd repaired, smiling with their families. Each face told a story of resurrection, of rising from ashes, just like mine. I sat down at my desk in the small office we'd built in the corner. On the wall behind me hung that burned wrench, the one that had survived the fire. I'd mounted it on a plaque with a simple inscription, broken but not useless. My phone buzzed. An email from a woman in Michigan who'd seen our story online. She wanted to know if I'd consult with her community center about starting a similar program. There were 3 more like it in my inbox. Kentucky, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. The rebuild project was spreading. Not because I was special, but because the need was everywhere. People were hurting. People were lost. People needed to know that their worst day didn't have to define them. I typed back a response. I'd be honored to help. Let's rebuild together. Before I left that night, I walked over to Bay 1, the first bay we'd built, the one I still considered sacred ground. Above it, we'd painted a simple phrase that had become our motto. We fix cars, we rebuild lives, we rise together. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the texture of the paint, and I thought about everything that had brought me here. The fire, the loss, the void, the struggle, the spark, the decision, the rebuild, the rise, all of it necessary, all of it painful, all of it worth it. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. Tom Harris? Speaking. Mr. Harris, my name is David Chen. I lost my business 6 months ago. My wife left. I've been living out of my truck. I saw your story online and I need to know if there's really a way back from this. If someone like me can start over. I closed my eyes, remembering that feeling. That desperate need for someone to say it was possible. David, I'm going to tell you the truth. It's going to be hard, harder than you think. There will be days you want to quit, days when you think the ashes won the fight. But here's what I learned. You don't have to rebuild everything at once. You just have to start with what's left. What if nothing's left? There's always something left. Skills, heart, the willingness to try. That's enough. That's always enough. Where are you located? About 2 hours south of you. Can you get here Saturday morning? 8 a.m.? Silence. Then, yeah, I can be there. Then I'll see you Saturday. And David? The fact that you made this call? That means you're already rebuilding. You just don't know it yet. After we hung up, I locked up the facility and stood in the parking lot, looking at the building we'd created from nothing. Lights off, quiet, waiting for tomorrow's transformation. The fire had taken my workshop, but it gave me something infinitely more valuable. It gave me the chance to help others rebuild theirs, not just their workshops, their lives, their hope, their futures. And in helping them rise, I rose too. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove home through the dark streets of my small Ohio town, past the empty lot where Harris Auto Repair used to stand, past the diner where Sarah worked,
Past the apartments where Daniel lived. Past all the places where broken people were sleeping tonight, not knowing yet that morning was coming, that help was available.
that someone who'd been where they were would be waiting with tools and truth and a simple message. You can start over. You can rebuild. You can rise. I learned it in the ashes. And now I spend every day teaching others the same lesson. The fire didn't destroy me. It refined me into exactly who I was meant to be.